Tim Lee is a fifth-generation Asian American of Filipino, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese heritage. In other words, we call him the MVP of the Asian American Center.
He's Asian America.
He is Mr. Asian America. But he recently finished his master's in theology and ministry at Fuller Theological Seminary just this past year. So that's him.
Yay.
And he works for the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students after serving with InterVarsity USA for nearly a decade. So Tim is no stranger to us, but let's welcome him to share with us again.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. So my presentation is titled Who Ministers to the Ministers? And it's navigating mental health as a Filipino Americans in campus ministry. And I just want to add the disclaimer that I am not a licensed therapist. I feel like I, want to be able to say that responsibly when I'm presenting on mental health. But mental health in ministry is something that I'm extremely passionate about. I've taken several steps to learn about it during my time in seminary, and have tried to integrate it in terms of my practice and ministry as much as possible. And to kind of preface this presentation, about 4 years ago, I took Professor Kevin Joy's course on Asian American pastoral ministry, and my research focused on mental health and wellness among university students in InterVarsity, which was actually their experience before the pandemic happened, and what helped them and within their community take steps forward towards wellness and support. And for this year's theme for Filipino American History Month, Standing with Those Who Struggle, I was inspired to do something similar using a similar framework, but interviewing Filipino American staff who serve in campus ministry, hearing their mental health journeys, what ministry looked like for them, and what kind of support systems they have to do their work. And so for the study, if you can go to the next slide, just kind of a little bit of an introduction of who I interviewed, over a dozen campus staff, primarily those working for InterVarsity, but also connected with some who work for Epic Crew. In this group of interviews, they consisted of men and women in their 20s and 30s, from geographically diverse places: California, Pacific Northwest, East Coast, Midwest, and the South. And for the purpose of this presentation and the recommendations that I find, it's mainly going to be for that context of working with InterVarsity. And I think that I want to say that that because of the work that this entails for Filipino Americans in campus ministry, they also, just are within these broader circles of the Asian American community, but also Christian ministry in general. And so if some of the ideas that are presented, they resonate with your context or can be adapted to fit that, I hope that while you're listening to this, that you may be inspired by some of these steps and the ways that ministers find their support as well. And on the next slide, I'll just share a little bit about the work that Filipino American ministers are doing on campus. The reality is they are pastors. They're shepherding their campus chapters. Some of them oversee multiple chapters on multiple campuses. Some specialize in cross-cultural ethnic-specific ministries, and many lead multi-ethnic chapters. They lead tons of structures: leadership meetings, small group studies, fellowship gatherings, retreats, and conferences. And as they're doing that, they also meet with students one-on-one for their discipleship, pastoring, their spiritual growth. And just some of the little things too of like honing it down. The way that they describe it is they do holistic ministry, addressing spiritual, but also physical and emotional needs, that all of them are interconnected and intertwined. And so they want to address the whole person. Among that also, the way that mental health and ministry intersect is oftentimes as they're meeting with students, they need to walk them through the process of what it looks like to seek professional help. They don't so much need to convince them that this is what they need, but rather, how do I find a therapist that fits my needs? How do I navigate the finances and the insurance? kind of conversation do I need to have with my parents if I'm still on their insurance? As I was interviewing with them, they're telling me that some of them are responding to crisis on a week-to-week basis. One person even shared that within 7 days, they had 2 incidents relating to talking people kind of away from the ledge. And they were just kind of sharing, it's like, do we have the resources and training to be able to do the work that's needed on the campus today? And the last thing is, they are opening up and sharing about their own mental health journey. You cannot lead someone where you yourself haven't been, and I think they realize that by being open, vulnerable, and authentic, it connects with their students and can help them in their own journeys as well. The last thing was like, I asked them, how often does mental health and wellness intersect with your ministry? Like every single day. Almost every individual conversation, something related to that will come up. And just to present a few statistics, if you go to the next slide, and these are more general and broad, but 13% of Filipino Americans say that they experience clinical depression. 21% of Filipino American adolescent and young adults have considered suicide, and only 10 to 15% seek professional help. I do want to say that on the Filipino American side of this, my interviews with these staff did not go like into the depths of addressing issues like colonial mentality or internalized oppression. If you want to hear more about that, I'd recommend listening to Dr. Eleanor Balon's lecture that she did for this series. It was very good, very informative. But these are just just kind of a slice of what Filipino Americans are experiencing. But then on the other side, the ministry side, 23% of ministers and clergy experience depression, 38% report feeling burned out, 8% have considered suicide. We know that people who are serving in leadership positions as pastors, as ministers, there is an isolation that they experience where they are often working alone. They're the lone rangers. And when you think about both of these things combined, mental health is at a huge risk for those who are ministering. And this is further compounded by the nature of the ministry that campus ministry takes for those who are working at InterVarsity or Crew. One, staff need a fundraise, personally, their own budget. So along with doing ministry, they need to be thinking, how do I end this year in the black? On top of that, the fundraising system that's used is very antiquated, intended for white professionals, usually men who often have strong church networks. And people do not realize the impact that this has for people of color who grow up in contexts that do not conceptualize well what missions work is, what support is, and the level of shame associated with asking people for money. Hey, what? Said in a more crude manner, if you are in ministry, you're also in sales. This also doesn't take into account Filipino Americans who are on staff who may be the only Asian person in their team, in their area, maybe even the region.
Yeah.
This doesn't take into account the amount of taxing labor emotionally that it takes to code switch from context to context, from your ministry team to ethnic specific chapters, to multi-ethnic, to individual conversations with different folks. And I hold these stories from the staff that I interview with care because they are not just statistics, but they are individuals, they are people with these journeys that have shared this vulnerably and authentically with me. But from what I hear, everything lines up. They told me that in their families, mental health was either not talked about or seen as something bad, something for that crazy aunt, something that prayer should make go away, something that you don't need to talk about with someone else. Community should be enough. But then also, when I talk to them, they say that they've gone to therapy for any of these reasons: depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, insomnia, bipolar disorder. The one thing that bucks this trend is that out of everyone that I've talked to, even if they didn't have a clinical diagnosis, they had seen a therapist or gone through counseling. Now, these staff are standing with those who suffer, students on our campus, but in many ways, they carry that suffering as well. And so going back to this course that I took with Professor Kevin Doy on Asian American Pastoral Ministry. You can go to the next slide. Here are 6 considerations that he had for the AANHPI churches to think about how they can integrate well mental health with their church ministry. 1, taking care of the stigma surrounding mental health, utilizing the pulpit, highlighting testimonies, consulting with professionals in that space, offering prayer ministry, and also finances and the budget for counseling and other services. When I did my initial project with students in 2020, and like I said, this experience preceded the pandemic, I can honestly say that InterVarsity did 3 of these well. And I think that did open up staff and the students to taking steps for their mental health. And that was utilizing the pulpit, having testimonies, and offering prayer ministry. Of course, the pandemic raised a lot of awareness and discourse on this issue. And it revealed a lot more in terms of the struggles that we as society have with mental health. With that said, I began to ask the staff that because mental health and ministry is now so intertwined, what are the ways that you get personal support for the work that you're doing? You can go to the next slide. And so, of course, like I shared, one of the main things, other than Kuya Jesus, who's able to be our personal support, therapy and counseling. I am so glad that everyone sought professional help because in many ways we needed it. And not just any therapy, but decolonize cross-cultural competency among their counselors and therapists. One even mentioned that they have an anti-racist specialized therapist who isn't faith-based, who isn't Christian, but helps them navigate their emotions and their relationship with the world, with politics, especially in a time like this. Next one, supervisors and directors and their staff teams. What I found to be one of the most important things was having a good supervisor with high cross-cultural competency and understanding of mental health to care for staff when everything falls apart and there's a breakdown. Directors and staff teams that would let someone take work off, they'd move heaven and earth to make sure the responsibilities are taken care of. No shame or guilt for taking that time off because they needed to take care of themselves. You can't put the oxygen mask on someone else when you need to put it on yourself. Other folks shared how their spouses, partners, and close friends were really critical for the mental health. Some of them even had the privilege of spouses who are licensed and help them understand their mental health and even help support their ministry. There are spiritual directors, life coaches, mentors who are also different places where they can draw from. One mentioned that just having a life coach help with time management. It's like when I got everything else in life in order, it felt like my mental health finally was in order as well. Many shared how they got support from their church. I put family with a question mark because people said, I feel the love and support with my family. I realize that when I go to therapy, the main thing I'm talking about is my family. They also talk about their InterVarsity Familia, the other Filipino InterVarsity staff who have been in these trenches together, where they could just be. A number of staff share how they appreciate being together as a Filipino American community that is like water for their soul every time they get a chance to meet. One said that there's a high chance that I'd actually leave InterVarsity if I did not have this community. I always talk about this, like having a healthy ecosystem where you have many wells to draw from for support. I think the phrase a constellation of support is a great way to think about who ministers to the ministers. It's not just one thing, but how can we have this constellation of support to take us on the journey and the ministry that we're doing? And not just personal support, but since pandemic, InterVarsity itself as an organization has taken strides to care well for those who are ministering. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the major things was during their Urbana Missions Conference, they dedicated an entire plenary session on mental health. They had a student share her testimony about how God met her, and the main plenary speaker was a licensed therapist who could give mental health 101 on trauma, ministry, brain chemistry, to destigmatize all the different things that may have been thought in the church and in our communities regarding mental health. They offer distress days during pandemic and additional days that people could take off where they just needed to take a mental health day. They even integrated it into their outreach. And so there's a little slide there of how have you prioritize your self-care in the midst of this in terms of their outreach to students. They have in-house spiritual directors that many staff can tap into. Even right now, the Asian American Ministries is doing a series during election year where they're having online sessions to care for emotional and mental health for their staff during election year, but also how to pastor their students well. More recently, this month, InterVarsity is forming an employee resource group for those with mental health diagnoses, and recently took a survey from these staff to be able to better inform and shape this group. And last but not least, InterVarsity has phenomenal insurance. So much so that people take it to their therapist like, wow, you only have a $25 copay for an out-of-network therapist. The thing is, they need to fundraise to have insurance that is that good. So these supports go a long way for caring for staff, and it makes sense because they're doing incredible work. But it also makes sense because we need good support for their well-being. And so I also asked them, you can go to the next slide, what training and preparation helped you to be able to minister to students in this way? And many said that it came from personal experience, that by meeting with their therapist, by just kind of sharing about their journey, this has informed a way for them to minister to their students. The next thing that they said was formal training, but not offered through InterVarsity. They talked about getting trained as an RA, or getting training at nursing school, or through their pastoral courses that they took in seminary. And then the last part is very context-based. So perhaps their supervisor or their region told them, this is something that I want your whole team to do. And so InterVarsity does have a course called Mental Health 101 that's optional and online that talks about what the role of staff are, they are not therapists, how to have good boundaries, how to direct towards professional care, and how to ask good questions for a basic assessment. However, I talked to some other other staff who work in different areas. One mentioned that for the Florida region, their fall retreat was entirely based on mental health care. What's the speaker talked about? They had licensed therapists on site, and their regional director made all of the staff take first responder training for any crisis. I talked to another staff who said that their area has a partnership with a local counseling network called Lifeology. They offer discounted therapy to both staff and students. And so if we go back to those 6 considerations that Kevin Doy shared, there's one that I think is important to think about an organization or a ministry as large as InterVarsity. If you go to the next one, and it is being able to offer mental health positive, trauma-informed training and resources for the staff. Might be hidden under that block there, but that's what's there. Mental health positive and trauma-informed training. It is what I believe our staff need and even their leaders need to do ministry what's needed today on campus. And I'll give a few examples of different models that have been used in ministry that were not trauma-informed or mental health positive, and some of the ill effects of that. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the ways that we're able to kind of identify leaders was using this acronym called FAT. You are looking for FAT students, faithful, available, and teachable. And, this kept things very simple for both staff and student leaders to identify who had leadership potential. I remember for myself that there was someone who fit everything. This student was the fattest. However, she mentioned that she had depression, but she was faithful, she was available, she was teachable, but we onboarded her on leadership. We said yes to her summer missions, and we had no idea how both of those things would not just tank her, but her entire team. And we began to see that it's like, there has to be more than just this to be able to serve our students well and not hurt them in the process. And so a new model that has been used you can go to the next slide, is rattle. So reliable, available, teachable,
Right.
then leadership capacity, and then as well as emotionally healthy, because we want our students to be able to thrive in taking places of leadership and not burn out, and sometimes even leave community as a result. So you could keep on the slide, but another thing that we saw was in our prayer ministry model of inner healing prayer, what we saw was, usually we'd have a prayer ministry. People would talk about times when they wanted a moment in their time to be healed. They'd revisit it, invite Jesus in. People would cry and were like, oh, Jesus must have done an incredible work here. I think what we did not realize is that are we actually re-traumatizing our students by living in these moments, handing them off and not doing any follow-up, and we have no training on how to lead our students out of their trauma? And so one of the big shifts is, instead of inner healing prayer and going back to these moments, we've done Emmanuel prayer. How can you be in the presence of Jesus? What is he saying to you in this moment? To avoid leading them to places that we can't help them in a professional way. One of the staff I interviewed, his name was Meldron, he said, sometimes religion itself is a huge reason why our students are experiencing anxiety, depression, and all these things. So I asked myself, how do I not evoke shame in students, but rather joy and freedom? I don't want to compound or exacerbate all the struggles that they already are experiencing. And so I want to show you the wish list, because this is what they said that they would want to be able to have as resources, but I also don't think that there is enough that is available to make this happen. But if they had kind of whatever they could for their supports, comprehensive in-house mental health resources, if there was in-house therapists that they can go to for themselves or their students, if there was a hotline that they could be able to reach in an event of a crisis or consultation. However, because therapists are licensed by state, a national organization would not be able to have this for one size fits all. Having financial funding for mental health care, that would be a game changer. But we all know that fundraising is hard enough just for the campus ministry itself, much less the needs of the ministry. And then the last thing is state-based networking system of recommended therapists, because with those constraints, if they just had recommended therapists that they can go to, they would know where they could send their students. And while those things are a bit too lofty, here are my recommendations for these organizations and staff. And so you can go to the next slide. First one is standardized mental health training for all staff. If they are trained on how to do recruitment and new student outreach, how to give a call to faith, it is important that they have the mental health 101 and first responder training for the needs that are on campus. They do that at orientation for new staff. Everyone gets it, because everyone who took the mental health 101 training said, I wish everyone else got this. Having a centralized location for a ministry playbook or small group resources on mental health and wellness. There's so many things, and people do not want to reinvent the wheel, but there's no place that people know where they can go to for these resources. I also have a recommendation for a full-time Filipino American InterVarsity director. I believe that the Filipino staff are doing great work. However, so many are wearing so many different hats, like leading many different chapters and campuses, and we need someone who's able to dedicate the full kind of time toward extending the Filipino ministry forward, but also pastoring well and caring for their staff. The staff talk about being able to pastor well holistically. They too need to be pastored well holistically, not just in their mental health, not just in their ministry, but also in their identity as Filipino Americans. And the last thing that I have is these confession groups, formation groups, because Filipinos, Americans, they're creating a place where they could just be themselves, places where people understood them, where they didn't need to explain it, places where they could speak out of honesty. And from Dr. Kurt Thompson, he talks about these confessional groups, which are not talking about confessing sin, but rather a place where people can be authentic, relational, sharing their fears and failures and their longings and desires. And it has a neutrality that goes beyond one-on-one therapy or counseling, but rather neutrality where everyone grows and benefits. And when I thought about that, it fits well what Fuller's FAMI formation groups offers, these places where people can meet, talk about their Filipino American identity, and take steps forward in these places and share their stories. And so, in conclusion, the mental health needs on campus are immense, and Filipino American campus ministers are feeling it, but they continue to serve faithfully. And I believe for organizations like InterVarsity, they have made great strides to be able to care well, but there are these growth edges. I think they can continue to do the good work that they're doing even better. And so thank you for listening. I open up the floor if there are any questions with what I just presented. Yes, Camille.
That was amazing. I loved it. I don't know if you could tell. I do have a question though, because like, I'm a trauma-informed specialist, as a lot of us are. And there's this thing about like promoting trauma-informed education that I just don't know if we talk about it, but how trauma gets weaponized. So would there be a context in that trauma-informed education that says, hey, these are also the signs for how someone can weaponize their trauma against you, right? And these are things to be aware of. So is there a part in that training that you would recommend, or is that something that could be added? Because I feel like right now in the context of like, you know, just living in unprecedented times, where because trauma-informed care is so new, it's now become the thing it's not supposed to be.
So I'll say this, as you're speaking, I'm like, this is well beyond my pay grade and even my educational grade. But one of the big things I just encourage is people in ministry, sometimes we hear the buzzwords, but we need professionals to be able to speak in to it, because who knows? It's like, oh yes, we're going from rat to rattle in terms of our, leadership models. We need continual information to be able to tweak and, make it better so there aren't these unintended consequences. And so I was just collecting this from, different staff that I have, but I would love to hear, more of your thoughts in terms of what that would look like of not to weaponize trauma, because it does feel like the buzzword that's now making its rounds among like mental health talk and ministry. And so how can we do that best? So I can't answer that question, but would love for you to or if you know anyone, to be able to speak more into that. So thank you. KP.
Okay, I feel like my question is just gonna oversell, but I'll frame it this way. Being or having a former career in sales, I very much feel for the pressure that goes on when you're trying to hit a certain key performance indicator, such as a number. I guess I'm just gonna phrase it this way: how much would mental health become more stabilized within the community, especially with the Filipino American community within InterVarsity, if the fundraising model was dismantled?
I'll say this, that among the people that I talk to, one of the things they talk about in therapy is their fundraising and how much anxiety is there. I talk to people who now do similar things as licensed therapists or nonprofits where they're not fundraising their salary, and they say that they will never go to that model again. So that's as much as I could speak to. It's very anecdotal, but I do believe that it's an added stressor that is not needed, because these folks are very good at ministry. They're not hired because they are very good salesmen. Yes.
All right. Really good. Thank you. I have a question. What would you guess? Because I don't know if this is part of your survey. What would you guess was the typical longevity of a Phil and minister compared to the white folks?
Let's go. So my best guess, so I did not interview folks who also left staff, so there's a bit of a survivor bias with the interviews itself. However, kind of just looking at a cross section of the Filipino university staff, usually initial call is about 5 years. Usually they get to sabbatical in 7 years of ministry. I do not see enough young Filipino staff make it to the first sabbatical.
Would you say under 20%?
In terms of retention,
Yeah,
I think it's a little bit higher than that.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah, maybe closer to like 50, maybe, yeah, but
compared to the white counterparts, you'd say,
so compared to their white counterparts, I'd definitely say it's lower. Yeah, I would say that across the board for staff of color in general. Yeah.
We have a comment on Zoom.
Oh,
Question. Salvador Del Mundo, we invite you to share your question if you can. I know you wrote a lot, but we can probably have it summarized if you're able to unmute, please.
Hi, I was just commenting on my experience as a mental health chaplain and Christian minister here in Houston. We have a lot of Filipino American communities here, but I find that one of the significant struggles unique to the experiences of immigrant families, particularly second and third generation Filipino Americans, of course, they often navigate what's referred to as a hyphenated identity that combines their Filipino heritage with their American upbringing. So this dual identity leads to various struggles, including cultural dissonance, identity confusion, and the pressure to conform to different expectations from both their families and the broader American society. Have you had experiences with this?
yes, and so thank you for asking that question. This aspect of identity, I would say that InterVarsity is actually has a lot of resources on that, so much so that many of the Filipino InterVarsity staff that are serving, they experience that as students, because at some of the conferences that we're at, it touches on identity. One of the ones I remember, sometimes it's on Moses, of what does it look like for him having multiple identities as a Hebrew, growing up in Egypt, later being a Midianite, but even Jesus himself, where he's being asked this question of, if you are the Son of God, then this. And I know that many Filipino Americans feel that, well, if you're really American, then this, or if you're really Filipino, then this, and they feel that tension. And I think that InterVarsity, at least, has been able to give very helpful trainings of what it looks like for you to step into both aspects of this identity, of what does it mean to be. So this is what one of my friends, David De Leon, would say when I was like, oh, well, I'm 50% Filipino, and people feel that kind of percentage in terms of their ethnicity, but even their nationality. And what he told me was like, you are 100% Filipino. And that's something that I needed to hear, something I needed to embrace, that I'm not dividing this up between Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, but these are all parts of me, as well as the American side. And the thing is I think that InterVarsity does so well of being able to help with identity, discipleship, and formation and the journey for staff as students. That's why I think a full-time Filipino American director for InterVarsity would be helpful in shepherding staff and giving them resources to continue that journey while serving others. I hope that answers your question.
Let me just be clear in terms of the term itself. Filipino Americans, the struggle for these hyphenated identities is that sometimes they don't feel as much as Filipino as much as they are Americans. And the reality is that sadly, they're not accepted in both. So they feel that liminal space, and that becomes a source of struggle, particularly mental health issues in terms of who am I really? One resource that I find helpful here, there's a journal article by a Filipino American as well, Tuason's article on both sides of the hyphen, exploring Filipino American identity. I find that very helpful because it helps identify the actual struggles, again, in the Filipino American context. But one of the primary struggles is even though they identify as Filipino American, that hyphenated identity, sadly, they are not generally accepted in both.
Mhm.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I know that one of the big things is not just in terms of identity, but also finding a sense of belonging, which can be very difficult when those are in conflict. Um, and so I guess some of the things that could be helpful that just come to mind is understanding where a lot of that may come from. I know that for some of the aspects of my own identity that was helpful was going through uh, Brown Bodies, White Minds by E.J.R. David to just understand a little bit more colonial mentality and internalized oppression. So I think there are, just different things that can be helpful in that. But also, like I said, it's like, I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm kind of just speaking from my own journey, things that I've researched, as well as the stories of my colleagues. Not sure if that was kind of sufficient to answer, but yeah, that's, I think, what have been helpful tools for us navigating our hyphenated identities as Filipino Americans.
Can we thank Tim one more time?